So this particular research involved looking at the efficacy of retention campaigns. So many companies do retention campaigns. This is basically campaigns which are targeted towards consumers. They want to keep those consumers, so they might give incentives. For example, you might kind of say for your next purchase, you might get $10 off. So these campaigns are very common. And many companies think that these campaigns work. Do they really work? So we had an opportunity to work with a cell phone company which was trying to do these retention campaigns. What was great for us is that they actually did a field experiment. For one group of customers who were randomly selected, they did a retention campaign. This was a pricing plan campaign. For another group of customers, they did nothing. What did we find? The group of customers who were actually in the retention campaign actually left a lot more. In fact, staggeringly a lot more. This was pretty bad for the company. So what's the big picture? Do retention campaigns work? Actually, en masse, they might not work. What we found was a more nuanced finding. They work, but only if you're there targeted. So do retention campaigns, but do it in a targeted way. So the key takeaways, again, focus on retention campaigns. I think primarily as many companies start thinking about these campaigns, the typical thing that most companies do is do a mass marketed campaign. Send a retention package to every one of their customers. Why? Because it's easy to do. They don't have to think too much. They'll send it to everyone. What did we find? Sometimes actually sending campaigns to people might actually make them start questioning their own behavior. For instance, in this particular case, for the cell phone company, when they sent a retention campaign, which was basically about looking at people's behavior, their usage patterns, and saying, look, there might be other plans that might be better for you, it made many customers question whether A, they were getting a good deal, and if they're getting a good deal here, why not look elsewhere? So what that suggests is retention campaigns must often be targeted campaigns. So think carefully about who in your customer base might be likely to leave. Don't do it mass, do it on a targeted basis. So on the surface, when you think about it, again, going back to this idea of retention campaigns, most people think the retention campaigns work. So let me give you some hard numbers, what we found. So in the study that we did, when we did the retention campaign, and this was for a bunch of customers from a telecom service, we monitored their behavior 3 months before the campaign and 3 months after the campaign. What we found was when these customers who were in the retention campaign, we looked at what happens 3 months afterwards, 10% of these customers left the service, as opposed to a control group where no campaigns were done, 6% left the service. So you would imagine on the surface, 4% is a staggeringly high rate of churn. Now, should companies not do these campaigns? That's not what we found. What we found was, on average, yes, it's very hard to kind of find evidence whether retention campaigns work, but it was very easy to find evidence for who it worked for. There were many sets of customers which had certain characteristics which are very easy for firms to observe for whom these campaigns worked. So surprising fact was, on average, they didn't work. And for many companies, I think this is an eye-opener, because what they should be thinking carefully about is, how should we customize even our retention campaigns? So I think this is very interesting. In terms of customization, what is very good nowadays is, especially many companies who are data-driven, they have a lot of information about their customers. So for instance, in the mobile phone context, companies routinely gather information about past consumption. In our case, we had information, for example, in the past 3 months that we had been collecting, what was the level of overage, which is the amount that people are consuming over the number of plan minutes. We had information about how much variability do they have. In 1 month, are they using 100 minutes? In the other month, are they suddenly using 200 minutes or 500 minutes? So these are very observable types of patterns that you can find in your own customer base. So many times what we found was cutting up the data on customers using these observable patterns might be a great way to customize. So let me give you a specific example. In our case, what we found was that people who were consuming a lot, way above the number of minutes that they had, consumers who had a huge amount of variation, consumers who had negative trend over the time that they were consuming less and less, those were the people who were likely to leave. And it will not be surprising, for many of these customers, doing a retention campaign actually made them more likely to leave. So sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie. Now, I think one of the interesting things that's going on nowadays, especially if you think about big data, analytics, and all of that, is companies are rapidly experimenting. So many companies out there routinely do A/B testing. Now, what did we find here? What we found here was it's not enough to just do A/B testing. It's important to analyze the data correctly. So let me give you a specific example. In our A/B test, one group was the people who received recommendations. The other group was people who received no recommendations. On the surface, people who received recommendations in that group and who accepted them actually churned less as compared to the control group. Now, you would imagine, well, then one might think that the retention campaign worked. But what's important to remember is that customers decided to accept the campaign. So there is self-selection there. So even for people who are exposed to the campaign and decided not to accept it, they actually churned a lot more. So the very fact that they were exposed to the campaign changed their behavior. So it's important when companies are doing A/B testing, they think carefully about what's randomized and what's self-selected by consumers. Glossing over the fact can actually lead them to think that some campaigns are successful when they are not. And A/B testing is something that we believe is going to be rapidly taking off in the day of data analytics. But again, doing A/B testing is easy. Analyzing it and interpreting the results correctly is way more important. So a lot of people, including some of my own work, has looked at pricing plans and how customers choose among pricing plans. What's a big problem there? Many of these things are self-selected by consumers. So from a company's perspective, if they want to look at the causal impact of what happens when they give pricing plans, it's difficult to do so a priori because there's an aspect of consumer self-selection involved. So how do we get around this? Convincing a company that they should do a field experiment. That is the gold standard of causal interpretation. What we ended up doing was doing a field experiment where, again, people were given some pricing plans and some people were not given any recommendations. So that helped us give a causal interpretation, which was very, very hard to do so just using secondary data, which many researchers have done. So I think what I'd like to continue on is work more on this area of pricing plans and recommendations. I'm actually working with a company down in Austin, which is starting to look at energy consumption and the whole idea of smart meters. How do we make people understand that when they are consuming electricity, they are on different tariffs and different tiers? What we're trying to do actually is to do a field experiment, again, making things salient to consumers and seeing how they might change their energy consumption over time or over days, depending upon how much they're consuming now. So that's the next plan.